This is the Infrastructure Matters podcast, brought to you by the Futurum Group. We explore the latest developments in hybrid cloud computing and the technology that underpins it. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the hybrid cloud computing landscape. The Infrastructure Matters podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take anything reflected in this show as investment advice. Now your co-hosts, Stephen Dickens, Camberly Bates, and Krista Maycumber of the Futurum Group.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infrastructure Matters podcast, an insider edition. And we've got Ajay Nair from AWS with us. Hey, welcome to the show, Ajay.
Thank you, Stephen. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure to have you on the show. So let's get our listeners and viewers here orientated. Position your role. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, but maybe let's start with some introductions.
Absolutely. So I'm the general manager for AWS Lambda as part of Amazon Web Services. In my role, I'm responsible for business product and engineering operations of the product line of AWS Lambda. I've been with AWS for about coming up on 10 years now, and I've been involved in building various forms of the serverless portfolio, including being the launch product manager for AWS Lambda.
Fantastic. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. The podcast's called Infrastructure Matters.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of discussion about serverless and what going serverless means, and you hear sort of conflicting views of what that term actually means. You see the server vendors, and I've been guilty of this in the past, going, servers matter. It's not about just services. So maybe let's start there first. Disambiguate the term for the listeners, what that means in your context, the way you look at it, and we'll maybe sort of factor in an AWS perspective there.
I can imagine the evolution and consternation associated with that word, Stephen. I am guilty of being part of the one who created one of those terms as well, so I certainly will take some responsibility for that. I think the definition of serverless has certainly evolved over the course of the years as well. When we initially launched with AWS Lambda in 2014, the term serverless was really designed to help people get that mental model of running code without managing servers or infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I think over the last almost decade now that we've been doing this particular piece of work, that definition has evolved. And today, when you talk to customers, their mental model of serverless is closer to delivering value for your customers without having to manage complex infrastructure capabilities. And what that translates onto a day-to-day basis is you're delegating the outcomes of building on the cloud to people who are experts on those outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about what development in the cloud looks like today, you have constructs like developing for distributed services. How do you manage failures at large scale and manage availability and performance, which today I consider grades over there. You've got complexities of managing large fleets of ephemeral compute and storage that comes in and out in a virtual capacity. You've got network connectivity between various resources that have to be managed with permission constructs and more that come with it. And all of those require a certain degree of expertise. And over the decade or so that we've been doing this, that expertise has become the norm. Everyone requires it to do their job, but that's not the job, right? Mm-hmm. The job is to deliver value to your end customers and so on and so forth. So what we see more and more is customers saying, if I can leverage AWS's expertise in delivering those outcomes, what we call well-architected outcomes like security, scale, performance, and availability, and I can focus my efforts on the differentiated work that I need to do for my customers, that's me adopting a serverless operational model, right? So today, serverless can be thought of more as that operational model of being able to run or build applications without having to focus on the undifferentiated heavy lifting of managing lower level infrastructure. and then ultimately delivering faster value to your customers.
If we look back over that last 10 years, and I'll get you to comment on this, we've seen AWS start to develop its own silicon, whether that's Nitro, Inferentia, Trainium, and a raft of others.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing sort of almost a divergent path, and I'd be keen to understand your perspective of how they come together. You've got servers matter and infrastructure matters to the point that AWS felt it wasn't getting what it needed from chip manufacturers to address the requirements it saw, so it developed its own. And then on a sort of parallel track, you've got serverless and an abstraction set of layers away from the underlying infrastructure. So maybe just kind of round those two converging thoughts out for me, and maybe that'll provide some context for our listeners.
No, it's an excellent question, and this I think is probably one of the benefits of the just breadth of customers that AWS sees supporting on top of us, right? What you will see is customers going through an evolution, and that evolution may be the class of applications they're building. It could be where they are in their own digital transformation journey and the cultural and operational transformations they need to do. It could be the fact that they are going through even business transformations based on the changes in industry today, right? Like with the rise of, in the past of mobile and today of AI, there is always a new trend that they have to react through. And when people are going through transformation, their needs shift. What is differentiated today becomes undifferentiated tomorrow, right? And so what we've seen is there was even when, for example, when Lambda started, we were seeing this emergent class of applications that, colloquially you will have referred to as cloud native applications or microservices based applications that all fit a very similar, for want of a better word, development pattern, right? It was a set of machines with load balancers without any state on top of it, relatively undifferentiated on top of the actual silicon they needed to run. So we're like, hey, we can manage that for you. You give us the code, we'll run it on your behalf. We can scale on that. On the other end of the spectrum, you continue to see applications which is differentiated on that. Like a great example is the class of deep learning related applications we are seeing today, which are deeply differentiated by the infrastructure they run on because they can squeeze performance. And there, the pattern hasn't settled yet, right? Like we haven't reached a point of consolidation and transformation. So I think what you see is AWS reaching out to that breadth of customers that we're engaging on and saying, look, there continue to be customers who either because of where they are in their transformation journey, because of the class of applications they're building, or their own cultural or operational transformation, or where they are in terms of what they're responding to, they need differentiated infrastructure, they need differentiated hardware. And that's where AWS continues to innovate. We leverage that innovation both at the silicon and hardware level, as well as our expert in operating that metal, and then serve it up as a service on behalf of customers where they're at the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, right? So where speed matters and infrastructure does differentiates you, use the infrastructure capabilities, where otherwise AWS helps you go by going serverless.
So you've mentioned customers a few times there, and I think you can develop whatever fantastic infrastructure you like in these hyperscale cloud platforms, but at the end of the day, it comes back to how customers are consuming it and what they're doing. How are you seeing some of those values and that value from that infrastructure and value from the Lambda service start to come through?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the if you look at why customers are adopting, I'll start with the serverless side of the equation and kind of work my way through the whole thing, right? So if you look at where customers broadly adopt AWS, there are typically three values that come up, right? Total cost of ownership, elasticity, and reliability, right? So we can grow with your business. You're able to do so in a cost efficient way, and you're able to do it in a way that you can depend and bet your business on it. We like to joke about serverless as being the compression algorithm for AWS's experience in delivering those things, right? And so those three values of total cost of ownership, elasticity, and speed continue to show up on AWS, on serverless as well, right? So customers typically see lower cost of ownership because they're spending less time doing things that they would otherwise. So they're able to use their builders for building applications, innovating on behalf of their customers, spending less time on operational and infrastructure level capabilities while getting a dial tone reliability and performance that they need for their customers at that front. Performance and security outcomes that today are rapidly becoming sort of table stakes for competing in any other domain comes sort of baked into the box, right? Because AWS is able to vertically optimize the stack from load balancers to placement to the raw compute infrastructure that's running on their behalf to squeeze that out. And ultimately, it all leads to agility, right? Like I like to tell my team, innovation comes from speed, and speed comes from doing less, right? And so because of the fact that they're able to iterate really quickly, they're able to ship faster. We have customers like Edmunds who have come to us and said applications that typically took them multiple months to build, they've been able to ship within scope of weeks, right? Close to about an 8x improvement in delivery speed by adopting capabilities like serverless. The place where AWS marries its strength in both what we're able to deliver on serverless as well as its infrastructure capabilities is in innovations like Firecracker, right? So Firecracker, for example, is a native virtualization or isolation tech that we have built that allows us to create lightweight micro VMs, which give customers per invocation isolation, which is pretty much unique in the market because of the fact that we control all layers of the stack. We're able to go and see that particular innovation and deploy it on that. So what a customer sees that as is as an inbuilt isolation and security construct in as the foundation of many of our serverless products like Lambda and Fargate without any effort on their part, right? Like that just comes batteries included on what they are able to do, right? And then on the flip side, the selection of infrastructure from the various classes of instances, everything continues to be a place where they see broader benefits.
It's interesting. Some of the things you mentioned there sort of fit with the rubric that I carry around. I call it fit for purpose, workload placement. An analogy people have heard me use a bunch of times is each workload's like a journey. Some journeys suit planes, some suit cars, some suit a push bike, some a train. All different forms of transport are applicable. Not one is more valuable than the other. Most of us own a car, but we're all used to taking different forms of transport. It's interesting now, and I picked up and I want to go back to it. The sort of 6 or 7 that I carry around are performance, availability, scalability, security. You mentioned cost, FinOps. The other one I sort of carry around and throw into that mix is eco. We're starting to see people place workloads in different places based on ESG. What's your perspective? I think the takeaway from both of our comments is one size doesn't fit all. Is there a sort of rubric or kind of workload placement model that you carry around in your mind, or that we should be thinking about from an AWS perspective?
I love those 7, and I think if I would wish that more decision makers were carrying those 7 in their head as rubrics for every evaluation, right? And I think that's a great place for us to definitely make comparisons. Your mental model of the right choice or right technology for the right workload absolutely resonates, right? Like you will ultimately hear, AWS talk about that technology choices are a strategy, not a dogma, right? Like what you choose to pick is ultimately a decision on what you do based on your business context and your needs of your customers, not something that is always a de facto choice, right? In general, what you will see is the places where AWS is able to operate your capabilities on your behalf, AWS takes on the responsibility of providing and meeting the bar for those ilities that you talked about: availability, scale, performance, resilience. You're delegating those responsibilities to AWS. So, for example, Lambda has a public SLA of 3.5 nines, right? And which says AWS stands by that the endpoint that you're running on top of us would be operating to that SLA. And if it goes down, we are responsible. We get called, not you, right, at that particular point. Other aspects like security always continue to be a shared responsibility, right? Like where infrastructure security remains AWS's responsibility, application security remains customer responsibility. On the flip side, to your point, there are constraints because there is opinions, right? If you're running things AWS's way, we will ask you to run certain things our way, right? For example, when you're running within Lambda, state isn't part of the equation. You have to manage that on your behalf. You have to use the selection of languages and container images that we provide on your behalf. Scaling behaviors are determined by Lambda. You don't get to arbitrarily see what the machine is under the box. So what we try to do is offer that as a spectrum of choice, right? So even if you take the serverless operational model where the goal is to delegate as much infrastructure as possible, we offer that as varying levels of delegation, right? So you have Lambda at one end where everything is down and delegated, code in, endpoint out, well architected outcome in the box. You have services like ECS Fargate, where customers are able to delegate the raw compute management. AWS manages the patching, host management, and all that for running your container infrastructure. But the customer has more flexibility on choice on how requests are getting placed and routed, etc. And you could even pick something like EC2 when compared to the actual physical machines that you own in the data center as another layer down over there, where you're saying, hey, you're able to manage sort of virtualization capabilities, but we manage the physical infrastructure on your behalf, right? So, and each of those comes with its own flexibility, which gives you more comfort and dial on what workloads you can run on top of it. But the outcomes also then become more of your sort of ownership and responsibility. So it feeds back to that model of saying, which outcomes do you feel you need to be, hands on wheel on for the good of your business? Which of those are you comfortable with delegating down to AWS and managing on your behalf? And that gives you that flexibility of running the workloads where you choose to, right? And we can talk about the specific workloads I see landing on various places, but that's sort of the broader mental model there.
So it's kind of my mental model with
Yeah,
a sliding scale almost of how
there
much
you
you
go.
want to be hands on,
Correct.
how much you're prepared to delegate to get those outcomes. Are you
Correct.
prepared to kind of at the furthest extreme put the code in and
Yeah.
be completely hands off? Or do
Right.
you want to be as hands on as possible and maybe setting some parameters in an EC2 instance and you've got your hands kind of in the recipe
Yep.
being involved? It's a sliding scale between
It's a
those two.
sliding scale, right? And what's funny is it's a model that we've seen since the beginning of the cloud, right? We have picked the other extreme with software as a service, where we have said you're completely delegating the capability with the service you're looking for, right? So in many ways, this is very much a notch even in that spectrum where you go and say, I'm giving you application code. How that application code runs as a quote unquote service in the cloud or on cloud native way, you manage that particular outcome. I will be responsible for how I compose those things together. And as with things, the further you move up the spectrum, the less you're doing. And in theory, that translates to you moving faster, right? Because all
Mhm.
you're doing is putting pieces together and delivering faster over there. The flip side is it's a shared partnership. AWS is your trusted partner in delivering those outcomes for you.
So we've talked about infrastructure there. We've talked about some of the sort of infrastructure components. We've talked about that sliding scale of kind of partnering with AWS. But if we take a lens beyond infrastructure, I know a little bit about AWS's portfolio beyond infrastructure. You've got databases, you've got AI and ML platforms, there's IoT and edge capabilities going out into industry verticals. We've got things like healthcare. Where do you see the serverless component fitting within that kind of broadest lens?
So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is of embracing of serverless as an operational model, right? And I think what you've seen AWS really do over the last, again, decade that we've been doing this is bringing that serverless operational model to more aspects of the portfolio that we offer, right? So if you again look at the general idea behind the operational model is that delegate as much as you can to AWS and own just the parts out of that differentiate your business. So if you look at innovations that we have done in the data management space with Redshift serverless or even EMR serverless, you've now offered flavors of those services that can run in a much more hands-off manner for customers, like operational responsibilities like scaling and others are taken care of it, and customers can operate their data stores in there as they see fit. Um, we already have with DynamoDB one of the original sort of quote unquote serverless databases that are in there, especially when used with its on-demand mode, where customers are able to delegate the scaling behaviors down to DynamoDB and they use it as a key value store or any other form factor that they see fit for NoSQL scenarios. So I think what you're seeing in general is that spectrum model being applied to all aspects of the portfolio, but starting from, I like to think of them as infrastructure primitives and application primitives, right? Infrastructure primitives tend to be, the load balancers and instance types and network constructs and disk drives and so on and so forth. And then you have application constructs like database, queues, functions or services, workflows, and more. And AWS probably has one of the broadest selections, well, not probably, has the broadest selection of services that we have that offer those application primitives over there between Event Bridge, Step Functions, Lambda, DynamoDB, and all our managed services, otherwise Redshift and others that are offering serverless services. I think the next frontier of innovation then looks at the classes of applications that you're calling out here, right? And there are more fit for purpose application classes that we can offer customers. And we have done this now with IoT, where there's a selection of services that allow them to do that. All of that interplay with these services. We have there's a burgeoning collection across our AI ML solutions, including capabilities like SageMaker that wrap some other services, as well as offer purpose-built capabilities for customers in building and developing ML solutions. One of my favorite examples is Amplify. Right, it's a smaller service, but what it does is offers customers a easy way for building front-end experience in web apps, right? And it's a higher level abstraction targeted at a specific application class, but underneath the covers, it builds on top of Lambda, DynamoDB, and others to give customers that higher level abstraction while getting the serverless operational model benefits that go over there. So as AWS, and again, led by customers, you'll see is you want the ability for them to offer that spectrum in all aspects of services across the application primitives that we offer. And you will see that selection continuing to grow.
So we've had a wide-ranging conversation here. We've done serverless, we've done applications,
Yep.
we've done databases. I think for me, as we look to wrap up, final question. What would be the way that you'd like your customers to potentially think about the Lambda and sort of the serverless portfolio within AWS? If you were to have the ability to speak through this platform to those end users, kind of what would the summation be? What would you like them to be thinking about as they embark on their AWS journey?
Yeah. I think from AWS's perspective, customers have actively embraced the serverless operational model and mindset. Right, we are over 1 million active customers on Lambda. We have over 2 trillion invocations on EventBridge every month, which is our premier eventing service. Over tens of trillions of requests on Lambda itself, right? So it is at a point where the serverless adoption model it's popular across large and small customers across all classes of industries as it goes. Most customers, the value that you have to think about is serverless first. Serverless brings you the agility and cost efficiency benefits that you expect from building on AWS. So start with the serverless operation model for any of your net new development that are going out there. And the thought process I'll leave you with again is innovation comes from speed, and speed means doing less, right? And so do less, go serverless.
I think you've practiced that before, haven't you? That's not the first time you've said this.
No, that's become sort of a pet phrase of mine for this one, and it truly reflects what I've heard back from customers on this. So it becomes an easy one to repeat.
I can't think of a better way to summarize our discussion. So, Ajay, thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
You've been listening to Infrastructure Matters, a podcast brought to you by the Futurum Group. This has been another Insider Edition. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.